Hello, my name is Brenton Harrison, and we're here today to finish up our series on equity-based compensation with a quick video on something called Restricted Stock Awards, or RSAs. Let's get started. If you've been following us during our series on equity-based compensation, we've covered a wide range of different forms of pay that you can get that's not pure hard cash, but is instead equity in your organization. We've talked about stock options. We've talked about restricted stock units. We've talked about employee stock purchase plans, employee stock ownership plans, and today we're finishing with restricted stock awards. And with this video, there's going to be a lot of similarities between what we discussed when it comes to restricted stock units, and for that reason, I didn't want them to be back to back. So that's why there's been a little separation. We started with restricted stock units. Today we're doing restricted stock awards. And another thing that we've done when discussing equity-based pay is split these different forms of compensation into two categories. There are will be yours benefits, where just because of the passage of time or certain things that you just have to wait in order to achieve, if you meet those terms, they will be yours. You don't have to do anything. And then we talked about could be yours benefits. And those are benefits where you have to have the passage of time or certain things that have fallen into place, but you also have to make the decision to come out of your pocket and pay for that benefit. That's why they could be yours. Restricted stock awards are another blend. They are not purely will be yours. They're not purely could be yours. It all depends on the agreement that you have set with your organization. But I want to make sure that we cover the details of these plans and also some of the similarities and differences that they have with restricted stock units. So let's talk about what restricted means when you're talking about RSUs versus RSAs. When we talked about restricted stock units, or RSUs, in part one, we talked about a vesting schedule. And that vesting schedule tells you how long you have to work at that organization in order to receive those shares as listed in your agreement. But an important distinction is that at the beginning of that agreement, before those shares have vested, you don't actually have any shares. You simply have a promise that if you wait a certain period of time while working for that organization, at that future date, you will be given those shares, but you do not actually own them. So when discussing RSUs, the restricted and restricted stock unit really refers to the fact that you don't have those shares right now, and your ability to get those shares is restricted based on the terms of your vesting schedule. If you meet the terms, you will get them. If you don't meet the terms in the agreement, you will never actually receive the shares of company stock. Conversely, when you're talking about restricted stock awards, or RSAs, the shares that are associated with them are actually issued to the executive at the date of grant. So there's no future promise. They're actually issued those shares, but those shares are going to be held by their organization until that employee or executive has met the terms as listed in their vesting agreement. So these RSAs have a vesting schedule as well, but it works very differently than how you find RSUs. And the reason that I say executive is because in many cases, people who are awarded RSAs are typically going to be like an executive at an early stage company, as opposed to them getting a higher salary from that organization when they may not be able to give it to them. Now, at that time of grant, this is where it starts to blend between a will be yours and a could be yours benefit. There are some organizations with will be yours benefits that don't require the executive to give any money out of their pocket to pay for those RSAs. And then there are others who will make them pay full market value. Others will give them a discount to fair market value. But whatever the applicable purchase price is, once it's paid by that executive, the shares are issued at grant, and that's when the vesting period for a restricted stock award actually begins. Now, unlike RSUs, if you have an RSA, you actually do get that stock, as we covered at grant, and you do have limited ownership rights as it relates to that stock, such as the ability to vote based on the power of those shares. So you do have some rights when you have an RSA. The difference is that if you have any unvested shares of RSAs and you decide to leave that company as an executive before they vest, you typically are going to find in that agreement that your organization has the right to repurchase repurchase those unvested shares because of your early departure. And this is really important. It seems like a small wrinkle, but it's extremely important that you understand this and why they would do this. If I am an executive at an early stage company and I have a restricted stock award and I have some shares that have a vesting schedule, let's say it's a year, there's another that has 2 years, there's another that has 3 years. Well, let's say that after a year, some of my shares have vested and I decide that I want to leave that organization. Well, with those vested shares, I can take them with me and I can do whatever I want to with them. They were restricted, but because the vesting period has ended, they are no longer restricted and it's now my stock. I can do with it as I please. But those latter periods, the ones that vest after 2 years and 3 years, those haven't vested yet because I haven't been there long enough. And if I leave at that point in time, those unvested shares are eligible to be repurchased by my organization. And that means that I would lose the ownership rights to them. I would get my money back, but I wouldn't have the ability to take them with me and participate in the appreciation of those shares. And the reason that an organization would do this is because they don't want to give restricted stock awards to an early stage executive who then takes those shares and immediately departs the company. They're giving them to you because they're believing that you're going to be there throughout the stages of that company as it grows. So let's go back to the restricted and restricted stock awards. We covered that in restricted stock units. Restricted really references the fact that you have to be there for a certain period of time before you actually get the shares in the first place. That's what the restriction is, the restriction of time. With restricted stock awards, the restricted is really referencing the fact that should you leave before those shares vest, you can't take all of them with you and have full ownership rights. So the restriction for that is not when you get the stock. You get the stock at the beginning, but it's held by your employer. And if you leave early, you will not be able to take those shares and participate in the appreciation. Now let's address the taxation differences between RSUs and RSAs, and we're going to finish with a concept we haven't covered yet called 83B elections. In talking about the taxation of RSAs, let's go back to the taxation of RSUs. We talked about the fact that when you have a grant of an RSU, you don't actually have any stock at that point in time. You simply have an agreement in front of you that says if you work for this period of time, at this regular interval, you will be given shares in a future date. With an RSA, you have those shares at the grant. So it's actually something where your rights are restricted. If you have unvested shares, you can't just leave, but you do have those shares. Why is that important? Well, with an RSU at grant, there is no taxation because you own no shares. But with an RSA, you do own those shares at grant. So we have to talk about the differences in why and when you're taxed for this RSA. Let's look at an example. Looking at this example, we'll be able to break down when there is an exchange of value and when that leads to taxation for an RSA. We have an executive who has 1,000 shares that are rewarded to them of company stock at $5 per share, and they pay for it. So they pay for that $5 per share, and because of that, there's no taxation, right? There's no discount. This is just the fair market value of those company shares at grant. Now, at vesting date, the value of those shares has risen to $10 per share. And because the value rose to $10 per share at vesting, there has been an exchange of value here. And because of that, our executive would owe ordinary income taxes on the difference between the value at the vest date and the value at grant date. Now that you understand that, let's assume that the executive holds their shares after the vesting date has passed, and when it reaches $15 per share in value, they then decide to sell. What would the taxes look like at sale? Well, you can see that by selling their shares for $15, there's going to be some capital gains tax. And some of this may look familiar when we talked about incentive stock options or when we talked about restricted stock units. So the executive now owes capital gains tax on the difference between the sale price and the vesting date price. So let's go to this chart and let's break it down. The difference between the $5 grant date price and the vesting date price of $10 was ordinary income, and they paid taxes on that in the year of vesting. If they wait 2 or 3 years and they decided to sell $15 as the sale price, they're going to pay capital gains at sale. And whether it's long-term capital gains or short-term capital gains is all going to depend on the time they wait post-vesting. If they decide to sell 6 months after vesting, well, we've now covered that in order to have a long-term capital gain, you have to hold your shares at least a year and a day. So if they sell after 6 months, that doesn't qualify. It would be a short-term capital gain, and short-term capital gains tax rates are the same as ordinary income rates. But if they decided to wait those 2 or 3 years, well, a long-term capital gain starts when you wait a year and a day. So if they wait that period of time, it would be a long-term capital gain, and their taxes would be either 15% or 20% of the gain. Now, it's important to note that the shares of RSAs don't always increase in value after vesting. In fact, they could decrease. And if they do decrease and they're then sold, there would actually be a loss based on the amount of taxes that are already paid. So let's look at an example of that. Let's assume that our executive paid ordinary income tax on the difference between their $10 vest price and the $5 grant price, but they then sold at $8 per share. So it went down. It vested at 10. They decided to sell after a decrease, and it's at $8 per share. Now, while this transaction would technically still be considered a gain because they bought at 5 and sold at 8, they would take a loss on the taxes they paid for the difference between that $10 vest price and the $8 sale price. And should the value of those shares have fallen even further before being sold, maybe even falling below that $5 purchase price, they could be subject to a total loss. So this is an example of where it doesn't always work out where, hey, it vested at 10, I sold at 15. What if it vested at 10 and you had to sell at 4? What if it vested at 10 and you sold at 7? You need to have an understanding that you can have a loss with the restricted stock award. Now, because of all these variables, the IRS has given RSA recipients a tool to hopefully minimize their potential for a big ordinary income tax event when these shares vest, and it's called an 83B election, and it could potentially reduce the risk of selling at a loss as well. So what is an 83B election? By utilizing an 83B election, an RSA recipient can choose to pay taxes on their shares at the date of grant rather than paying them at the date of vest. And they're doing this hoping that they can minimize the risk of seeing a large increase in the share price between those two dates. So let's go back to our example to see the difference. Going back to our example, we have an executive who was granted RSAs at a grant date price of $5 per share. That's what they actually paid for the shares. By the vesting date, the value had risen to $10 per share, and they decided to wait a certain period of time and sell those shares at $15 per share. So with an 83B election, what they're going to decide to do is they're going to decide to pay the taxes on any profits at the date of grant. So even though they haven't gone through the full vesting period, they're saying, I just want to get my taxes out of the way. I don't want to wait that period of time. Now, if there had been a discount to the fair market value of that company stock, let's say that they bought it at 3, but the value of those shares was $5, then there might have been some taxes. But in our scenario, they bought it at 5 when the value was 5. And because there's been no gain in the share price at grant in terms of the value they receive, they would actually owe no ordinary income tax on the transaction. So they filed an 83B election saying that they want to pay the taxes, but because there's been no gain, there actually is no tax. Additionally, if the vesting of these shares occurs more than a year after they've made that election, they could then immediately sell them after they vested for a long-term capital gain. And let's look at this again. Remember, we talked about that difference between the $10 vest price and the $15 sales price. Well, there's a gain there. And if there is that gain, you would have to say, hey, this is a capital gain. I need to wait at least a year and a day for it to be a long-term capital gain. Anything I sell before then would be a short-term capital gain. But in this scenario, if they paid taxes at 5, then anything they sell at 15 is a capital gain from 5 to 15 instead of 10 to 15. And if they've waited at least a year after they file the election, then it would all be a long-term capital gain instead of them, in our prior example, having a portion that was ordinary income at vesting and a portion that was a capital gain at sale. Now, this may seem like a no-brainer, but there are several risks that you have to consider before you make this election. The first is that 83B elections have to be made within 30 days of the RSA grant, and that requirement doesn't give you much time to make a decision on whether there's a benefit to front-loading that tax on any unvested shares or whether it's better to wait until they vested and pay the taxes at that time. And this decision is really consequential because the second requirement of an RSA is that if you leave the organization, it's not even really a requirement, it's just something to consider. If you leave the organization before the shares have vested, you will, in that scenario, have paid tax on shares which you don't actually control and are now at risk of being repurchased. So while having that stock that loses value or is taken from you prior to vesting would typically permit you to claim a capital loss, hey, I didn't get the value of those shares, so I can claim it as a loss. With 83B, you aren't allowed to claim any losses beyond what you actually paid for the stock. So this means that if you received a grant at no cost and it later became worthless or those shares were repurchased, you wouldn't actually be able to claim a loss at all. So even though this seems like common sense, if you don't know if you're going to be at that organization long enough for these shares to vest, there is still some real risk to claiming an 83B election. Now, those are the risks, but let's talk about the positives. If you are an executive that stays at that organization long enough for the shares to vest and those RSAs actually increased in value, you could have filed that election and paid little to no ordinary income taxes. And you also have shortened the period that you have to hold those shares after they vested for you to be able to sell them for a profit. That's it. By this point in time, we've covered 5 different types of equity compensation. And believe it or not, there are other forms that we haven't covered, but I believe this gives you a really strong foundation in terms of understanding how these different tools work. My name is Brenton Harrison. I really hope that you enjoyed this series. If you like the content that we're putting out, please subscribe to our channel and subscribe to the notifications so you know when new content is being posted, and we'll keep bringing it to you as frequently as we can. See you soon.